You have arrived here because something ancient stirs within you, a recognition that whispers through the corridors of your psyche, telling you that what you carry is not simply sensitivity, but a sacred burden older than memory itself. And if you feel this stirring, if these words penetrate the carefully constructed walls of your conscious mind, then you must prepare yourself. For what I am about to reveal will shatter the gentle mythology surrounding empathy and expose the raw alchemical truth of your purpose. The empath, you see, does not simply feel what others feel. No, that is the surface understanding, the digestible version fed to a world that cannot stomach the deeper reality. The true empath is a psychic lighthouse, standing at the edge of consciousness, casting their light into the vast unconscious waters where humanity's shadows swim like ancient leviathans. And here lies the first truth that will disturb your sleep. Darkness is not attracted to darkness. Darkness is attracted to light. The shadow does not seek another shadow to hide within. It seeks the illumination that can finally reveal its form, give it substance, make it real. This is why you, the empath, find yourself surrounded by the wounded, the broken, the lost. Not because you are broken yourself, though the world may have convinced you of this lie, but because your very existence is a beacon in the psychic wilderness, calling forth every unloved aspect of the human soul that wanders in exile. I have spent decades exploring the labyrinthine depths of the human psyche, and I can tell you this with absolute certainty. The empath is not a victim of circumstance. They are an agent of transformation. But transformation, true transformation, requires descent. It demands that we journey into the underworld of the psyche, where all that has been rejected and repressed waits to be witnessed. When you walk into a room and feel the weight of unspoken sorrow pressing against your chest, when you sit beside someone and suddenly taste their rage like copper in your mouth, when you wake from sleep carrying dreams that are not your own, you are not experiencing emotional overflow. You are experiencing psychic communion with the collective shadow. The shadow, as I have written extensively, is not evil. It is unlived life. It is the repository of all the qualities, impulses, and aspects of the self that have been deemed unacceptable by consciousness. Every person carries this shadow, and most spend their entire lives running from its embrace. But the empath cannot run. The empath is pulled magnetically into the gravitational field of others' shadows, and here lies the hidden cycle begins. Let me paint for you the architecture of this invisible process, for it unfolds in stages as precise as any chemical reaction, as inevitable as any law of physics. But unlike the predictable world of matter, this operates in the realm of psyche, where time bends and causality dances in spirals. The first movement, the call of shadows. First comes the attraction. You meet someone and something in you recognizes something in them. But what you are recognizing is not love, not compatibility, not even shared trauma. You are recognizing their unlived darkness, their disowned pain, their rejected wholeness. Your psyche, in its infinite wisdom and sometimes terrible compassion, whispers, "Here is a soul fragment seeking home." This recognition operates below the threshold of consciousness. You may think you are drawn to their smile, their intelligence, their struggle, but beneath these surface attractions, something far more ancient is at work. Your unconscious has detected the presence of unintegrated shadow material, and it responds the way a magnet responds to iron. I have observed this phenomenon countless times in my practice. The empath who consistently finds themselves in relationships with narcissists is not masochistic. They are responding to an unconscious call for help from shadow material that has become so defended, so armored, that it can only be reached through the permeable boundaries of an empathic soul. The empath, who attracts those struggling with addiction, is not codependent by choice. They are answering the desperate plea of a shadow that has been numbed into silence, seeking someone who can feel what it cannot express. This attraction is not random, it is archetypal. It follows patterns laid down in the collective unconscious, patterns that have been repeating for millennia. The wounded healer seeks the wound that calls to their gift. The light bearer is drawn to the darkness that hungers for illumination. But here is where the danger begins, because this attraction feels meaningful. It feels like destiny, like love, like purpose. And in a sense, it is all of these things. But it is also a trap if you do not understand what is actually occurring. The second movement, the osmosis of darkness. Then comes the osmosis. Without conscious awareness, you begin to carry what they cannot hold. Their rage becomes your irritability. Their grief becomes your inexplicable sadness. Their terror becomes your anxiety. You do not choose this. It happens at the level of the unconscious, where energy follows the path of least resistance, flowing from the defended to the open, from the armored to the permeable. This is the stage where most empaths believe they are going insane. They feel emotions that have no apparent source. They carry pain that has no origin in their personal history. They weep for losses they have never experienced. The medical world calls this anxiety, depression, emotional dysregulation. But these are merely symptoms of a deeper phenomenon, psychic osmosis. I recall a patient, a woman of extraordinary sensitivity, who came to me exhausted and bewildered. She had been married for 7 years to a man she described as emotionally unavailable. She could not understand why she felt constantly angry, why she raged at small inconveniences, why she had developed a tremor in her hands that had no medical cause. Through our work together, it became clear that she was carrying her husband's disowned rage. He had learned in childhood to suppress all anger, to present himself as perpetually calm and reasonable. But the rage had not disappeared. It had found a home in his wife's nervous system, expressing itself through her more permeable boundaries. This is not metaphor. This is energetic reality. The empathic person becomes a vessel for the psychological material that others cannot contain. Their nervous system takes on the load of processing emotions, traumas, and shadow aspects that belong to other psyches. Yet, even in this contamination, there is a strange form of service occurring. The empath is functioning as a psychological waste treatment plant, taking on the toxic material that others have expelled from their consciousness and attempting to process it through their own system.
The third movement, the alchemy of integration. Next comes the integration phase, though few empaths recognize it as such. Your psyche, brilliant and adaptive, begins to weave their shadow material into your personal mythology. You create stories to explain the unexplainable. You develop symptoms to contain the uncontainable. You may fall into depression, develop mysterious illnesses, or find yourself acting in ways that feel foreign to your nature. This is not pathology, this is alchemy. Your soul is attempting to transform what it has absorbed. But here lies the danger. If you remain unconscious of this process, if you continue to believe that what you feel is simply what you feel, you will become lost in the maze of others' psychological material. You will mistake their shadow for your own, their wounds for your inheritance, their unlived life for your destiny. The integration phase is where the empath's psyche attempts to make sense of the foreign material it has absorbed. Like a skilled craftsperson working with raw materials, the unconscious begins to weave these shadow fragments into the fabric of the empath's personal identity. This is why empaths often develop complex psychological profiles that seem to encompass multiple personalities or trauma histories that don't quite fit their actual experience. They are not dissociating or inventing false memories. They are integrating the psychic residue of others' unlived experiences. I have worked with empaths who carried ancestral trauma that was not their own, who manifested symptoms of abuse they had never experienced, who expressed rage that belonged to their partners, parents, or clients. Their psyches had become repositories for the collective unconscious material of their social circle. This integration attempts to serve a sacred function. The empathic person is trying to transform raw shadow material into something that can be understood, processed, and ultimately healed. They become unconscious shamans, taking on the spiritual illness of their community and attempting to cure it through their own psychological alchemy. But this process exacts a tremendous cost. The empath becomes fragmented, carrying pieces of multiple psyches without clear boundaries between self and other. They lose the thread of their own authentic experience, buried under layers of absorbed material. The tragedy is that this sacrificial service rarely leads to actual healing for anyone involved. The person whose shadow has been absorbed does not integrate it simply because someone else is carrying it. If anything, the externalization of their shadow material may make them more unconscious, more defended, more cut off from their own depths. And the empath, overwhelmed by foreign psychological content, becomes less capable of their own growth and individuation. They become stuck in what I call the martyred healer complex, identifying with the suffering they carry. They wear pain like a sacred vestment, believing that their value lies in their capacity to endure what others cannot bear. But this is a distortion, a spiritual materialism that keeps both the empath and those they serve locked in unconscious patterns. The martyr complex develops when the empath begins to derive their sense of identity and worth from their ability to absorb and carry others' pain. It becomes not just what they do, but who they are. They cannot imagine themselves without the weight of other shadows, because that weight has become the foundation of their self-concept. This complex is reinforced by a culture that romanticizes self-sacrifice, that praises the helper and the giver while ignoring the psychological cost of perpetual service. The empath learns to present their exhaustion as dedication, their boundary violations as compassion, their self-abandonment as love. But beneath this noble exterior, something darker is at work. The martyr complex serves unconscious needs that the empath may be reluctant to acknowledge. It provides a sense of specialness, of being chosen for a sacred task. It offers identity and purpose. It creates the illusion of control over chaos and meaning from suffering. The martyred empath becomes addicted to being needed, to being the one who understands, who can handle what others cannot. They develop what I call a savior superiority, a hidden belief that they are more evolved, more capable, more spiritually advanced than those they serve. This superiority is the shadow side of the helping archetype. It allows the empath to avoid their own work of individuation by focusing entirely on others' healing. It provides an escape from the difficult task of facing their own unlived life, their own rejected aspects, their own need for growth and change. The martyr complex also serves as protection against the terror of being ordinary, of being just another person struggling with their own psychological material rather than a chosen vessel for collective transformation. But this protection comes at an enormous cost. The empath trapped in the martyr complex cannot individuate, because they cannot separate their identity from their function. They cannot develop authentic relationships because they can only relate to others through the dynamic of helper and helped. They cannot access their own creative potential because all their energy goes toward processing others' psychological waste. The fifth movement, the moment of choice. The fourth stage of the cycle is the most crucial, the choice. At some point, every conscious empath must face this decision. Will I continue to be a passive receptor of the collective shadow, or will I become an active transformer of it? This choice cannot be made from the mind alone. It requires a descent into your own underworld, a confrontation with your personal shadow that has been feeding on the shadows of others. You must ask yourself the most uncomfortable questions. What am I gaining from this cycle? How does carrying others' darkness serve my unconscious needs? What part of me finds identity, purpose, and even a twisted form of love in being the bearer of burdens? The moment of choice rarely arrives as a dramatic revelation. More often, it emerges slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape that has been shrouded in darkness. It may begin with a dream, a moment of exhaustion so profound that it cannot be ignored, or a sudden recognition that you no longer know where you end and others begin. For some empaths, this moment comes as a crisis. Their body breaks down under the weight of processing other psychological material. They develop autoimmune disorders, chronic fatigue, or mysterious illnesses that resist conventional treatment. Their nervous system, overwhelmed by constant empathic absorption, begins to malfunction. For others, the choice emerges through relationship patterns that become impossible to ignore. They find themselves repeatedly attracted to the same type of wounded person, playing out the same dynamics of absorption and depletion. The repetition becomes so obvious that even the unconscious can no longer maintain its denial. Sometimes the choice is precipitated by a moment of clarity so stark that it cannot be unseen. The empath recognizes that their helper, the person whose shadow they have been carrying, has not healed despite years of their energetic service. They realize that their absorption of others' darkness has not led to transformation, but to perpetual cycling of the same unconscious patterns. This recognition can be devastating. It means acknowledging that the sacred purpose they thought they were serving may actually be perpetuating the problems they sought to solve. It means facing the possibility that their empathic gift, unguided by consciousness, has become a form of enabling rather than healing. The choice that emerges from this recognition is stark. Continue in unconscious absorption and face certain burnout and fragmentation, or learn to work with shadow material consciously, with boundaries, with discernment.
The sixth movement, the descent into personal shadow. These questions will lead you to uncomfortable truths. Perhaps you discovered early in life that the only way to receive attention was through your sensitivity to others' pain. Perhaps you learned that being needed was safer than being seen. Perhaps you confused your ability to absorb with your capacity to heal. The descent into personal shadow work is the most challenging phase of the empath's transformation. It requires brutal honesty about the unconscious motivations that have driven their empathic service. It demands that they examine not just what they give, but why they give it. This descent often reveals childhood patterns that shape the empathic response. The child who learned to monitor their parents' emotional state to avoid explosive anger. The child who became the family's emotional regulator, absorbing tension and returning calm. The child who discovered that their sensitivity was both a survival tool and a source of special recognition. These early adaptations, while necessary for survival in a chaotic or emotionally unstable environment, often become unconscious compulsions in adulthood. The empath continues to scan for others' emotional distress, continues to absorb and process what they find, continues to sacrifice their own emotional needs for the stability of the collective. But the personal shadow work goes deeper than childhood patterns. It requires facing the parts of the empathic identity that have become corrupted by unconscious motivations. The hidden superiority complex that enjoys being more sensitive than others. The victim identity that gains power through suffering. the savior complex that needs others to remain wounded in order to maintain its purpose. Perhaps most challenging is confronting the ways that empathic absorption has been used as a defense against personal growth. By focusing entirely on others' healing, the empath can avoid the difficult work of facing their own unlived life, their own rejected aspects, their own need for individuation. This shadow work often reveals that the empath has been just as defended as those they serve, just in a different way. While others build walls to keep feelings out, the empath has become a sponge that absorbs everything but digests nothing. Both strategies avoid the conscious engagement with psychological material that leads to actual transformation. The descent into personal shadow also confronts the empath with their own capacity for cruelty, manipulation, and selfishness. These qualities have not been absent. They have been projected onto others or expressed through passive-aggressive means. The empath who has never acknowledged their own anger may express it through martyrdom, making others feel guilty for their needs. The empath who has never claimed their own power may manipulate through weakness, controlling others through their apparent vulnerability. The seventh movement, the revelation of true purpose. But here is the revelation that changes everything. You cannot heal what you absorb. You can only transform what you consciously engage with. When you remain unconscious of the shadow material you carry, it does not disappear. It ferments within your psyche, creating what the alchemists called the prima materia, the raw, unformed substance that must be worked upon before it can become gold. But if you do not work with it consciously, if you do not apply the fire of awareness to this psychological matter, it will work on you instead. This revelation strikes at the heart of the empathic assumption that absorption equals healing. It challenges the fundamental belief that by taking on others' pain, the empath is somehow transforming it. In reality, unconscious absorption simply relocates the problem without resolving it. True transformation requires consciousness. It requires the ability to see shadow material clearly, to understand its origins and functions, to work with it through awareness rather than absorption. This is the difference between being a passive receptacle for others' projections and becoming an active agent of psychological alchemy. The prima materia, in alchemical terms, represents the raw, chaotic material that must be refined through various processes to become the philosopher's stone. In psychological terms, it represents the unintegrated contents of the psyche that require conscious work to become sources of wisdom and power. When the empath absorbs shadow material without consciousness, they are simply accumulating prima materia without the knowledge or tools to transform it. Their psyche becomes a repository of raw, unprocessed psychological content that ferments and putrefies rather than transforming into gold. This is why so many empaths experience what feels like psychological poisoning. They are carrying toxic material that has not been properly processed. Their dreams become dark and disturbing. Their emotional life becomes chaotic and unpredictable. Their body manifests symptoms of systemic toxicity. The fire of awareness is what transforms prima materia into something valuable. This fire is not the gentle warmth of acceptance or the soft light of understanding. It is the fierce heat of conscious confrontation, the willingness to look directly at shadow material without flinching, without absorbing, without immediately trying to fix or heal. The eighth movement, the alchemy of conscious transformation. This is why so many empaths find themselves in cycles of exhaustion, illness, and emotional chaos. They have become unconscious alchemical laboratories processing the collective shadow without the knowledge or tools to complete the transformation. But when you awaken to this process, when you begin to see your sensitivity not as a curse but as a calling, everything shifts. You realize that your role is not to carry the shadow, but to illuminate it, not to absorb the darkness, but to help it find its own light.
The awakening to conscious empathic function is like the difference between being a sponge and becoming a mirror. The sponge absorbs everything indiscriminately, becoming saturated and eventually toxic. The mirror reflects clearly, without taking on the qualities of what it reflects. The shift requires developing what I call psychic discernment, the ability to feel another psychological state without merging with it, the capacity to witness shadow material without being contaminated by it, the skill of holding space for transformation without taking responsibility for the outcome. This discernment is perhaps the most difficult skill for an empath to develop because it goes against every instinct that has kept them alive. The merging, the absorption, the taking on of others' material often developed as survival strategies in childhood environments where monitoring and absorbing others' emotional states was necessary for safety. But what served survival in childhood becomes a limitation in adulthood. The empath must learn to override these deeply ingrained patterns, to feel without merging, to witness without absorbing, to serve without sacrificing. This requires developing a strong sense of psychic boundaries, not walls that keep everything out, but permeable membranes that allow for connection while maintaining distinct identity. These boundaries are not built through mental effort alone, but through the cultivation of what I call energetic sovereignty. Energetic sovereignty is the ability to maintain your own energy field regardless of what is happening around you. It is the capacity to remain centered in your own experience while being fully present to others' experience. It is the skill of conscious empathy rather than unconscious absorption.
The ninth movement, the sacred function revealed. This is the sacred function of the conscious empath, to be a psychic midwife for the collective unconscious, helping to birth into awareness what has been gestating in the darkness of repression and denial. The image of the psychic midwife captures the true function of conscious empathic service. A midwife does not take on the labor pains of the birthing mother. She does not absorb the difficulty or danger of the birth process. Instead, she provides skilled presence, creates a safe container, and assists in the natural process of bringing forth new life. The conscious empath learns to function in this same way with psychological material. They can sense when someone's shadow content is ready to emerge into awareness. They can create a safe space for this emergence. They can provide skilled assistance in the process of integration, but they do not take on the shadow content as their own. This requires tremendous skill and training. The psychic midwife must be able to read the subtle signs that indicate readiness for transformation. They must know when to offer assistance and when to step back. They must understand the natural rhythms of psychological birth and death. Most importantly, they must trust the intelligence of the psyche itself. Just as a midwife trusts the mother's body to know how to give birth, the conscious empath must trust the individual psyche to know how to heal and integrate its own shadow material. This trust goes against the empathic instinct to fix, to heal, to make everything better. It requires the wisdom to know that some processes cannot be rushed, some shadows cannot be forced into the light. Some healings require time and patience that extends beyond the empath's involvement. The psychic midwife function also requires the empath to develop what I call transpersonal perspective. They must be able to see individual psychological struggles as part of larger archetypal patterns. They must understand that the shadow material they encounter is not just personal but collective, not just individual but universal. The 10th movement, the challenge of discernment. But this work requires tremendous discernment. You must learn to feel without absorbing, to witness without carrying, to illuminate without being consumed. This is perhaps the most difficult skill in the world to develop, because it goes against every instinct that has kept you alive. The development of empathic discernment
is like learning to be a skilled surgeon of the psyche. A surgeon must be able to cut into tissue without being emotionally overwhelmed by the blood and pain they encounter. They must maintain steady hands and clear thinking even in the midst of life and death situations. The unconscious empath must develop similar skills. They must be able to feel the full intensity of another's psychological pain without being destabilized by it. They must maintain clarity and presence even when encountering shadow material that would normally trigger their absorption response. This discernment begins with learning to distinguish between your own psychological material and what belongs to others. This sounds simple, but is extraordinarily challenging for someone whose boundaries have been permeable since childhood. The empath must learn to recognize the energetic signature of their own emotions versus the foreign feel of absorbed material. They must develop the ability to track the source of their psychological experiences, asking constantly, "Is this mine? Where did this feeling originate? What am I responding to in this moment?" This tracking requires what I call forensic self-awareness, the ability to examine your own psychological state with the detachment of an investigator. When anxiety arises, the conscious empath learns to ask, "When did this begin? What preceded it? Who have I been around? What might I have absorbed?" This investigation is not paranoid or neurotic. It is skilled psychological hygiene as necessary for the empath as physical hygiene is for the surgeon. The discernment also extends to recognizing when someone is ready for their shadow material to be illuminated versus when they are seeking someone to carry it for them. The difference is subtle but crucial. Someone ready for transformation will engage with their material when it is reflected back to them. Someone seeking a carrier will resist, deflect, or attempt to reload the empath with their shadow content. The 11th movement. The mirror versus the sponge. The unconscious empath merges. The conscious empath mirrors. When someone brings their shadow into your presence, instead of unconsciously absorbing it, you learn to hold it in the sacred space between you. You become like a dark mirror reflecting back to them what they cannot yet see in themselves, but you do not take it on as your own. The transformation from sponge to mirror is the core shift in conscious empathic function. It represents a fundamental change in how the empath relates to other psychological material. The mirror function requires the empath to develop what I call reflective presence. This is the ability to be fully present with someone's shadow content without either rejecting it or absorbing it. It is a kind of loving witnessing that neither judges nor merges. When functioning as a mirror, the empath becomes a clear surface that can show others aspects of themselves they have been unable to see in themselves. This reflection happens not through interpretation or analysis, but through the quality of presence itself. The person encountering their reflection in the empathic mirror may experience recognition, shock, resistance, or relief. These are natural responses to seeing previously unconscious material. The conscious empath learns to hold steady regardless of the reaction, maintaining their reflective function without being pulled into the drama of the revelation. This mirroring requires the empath to be clear of their own projections and shadow material. A dirty mirror cannot provide a clean reflection. The empath must engage in ongoing self-cleaning, constantly examining their own psychological state for contamination or distortion. The mirror function also requires tremendous humility. The empath is not showing others their shadow content in order to feel superior or to demonstrate their insight. They are simply providing a clear surface for self-recognition. The wisdom and integration that may result belongs entirely to the person doing the looking. The 12th movement, the development of psychic sovereignty. This requires what I call psychic sovereignty. You must develop an unshakable sense of where you end and another begins. You must cultivate the ability to feel deeply while remaining rooted in your own center. You must learn to love without losing yourself, to serve without sacrificing your essence. Psychic sovereignty is the foundation of all conscious empathic work. It is the psychological equivalent of national sovereignty, the right and ability to govern your own inner territory without interference from foreign powers. For the empath, developing psychic sovereignty means learning to maintain the integrity of their own energy field regardless of the psychological weather around them. It means becoming unshakable in their sense of self even when others are projecting their shadow content or attempting to merge energetically. This sovereignty is not built through defensive measures or emotional armor. These strategies simply replace absorption with numbing, trading one unconscious pattern for another. True sovereignty comes from developing such a strong connection to your own center that external influences cannot dislodge you from it. The cultivation of psychic sovereignty begins with what I call energetic embodiment. The empath must learn to feel their own energy as distinct from others, to sense their own boundaries as real and protective rather than imaginary or selfish. This embodiment often requires healing the original wounds that created boundary permeability in the first place. The child who learned that merging was safer than separating must heal the trauma that made separation feel dangerous. The adolescent who discovered that absorbing others' pain brought love and attention must find healthier ways to connect and be valued. Sovereignty also requires the development of what I call psychic self-defense. Not the paranoid kind that sees enemies everywhere, but the skilled kind that can recognize and deflect projection, manipulation, and energetic intrusion without losing compassion or connection. This self-defense includes practical skills like energetic clearing, boundary visualization, and protection rituals. But more fundamentally, it includes the psychological skills of recognizing manipulation, refusing projection, and maintaining your own reality even when others are attempting to impose their own.
The 13th movement, the path to mastery. The path to this mastery begins with shadow work, but not the shadow work most people imagine. You must first reclaim your own rejected aspects before you can safely dance with the shadows of others. You must integrate your own darkness before you can serve as a lamp for others' night journeys. The shadow work required for empathic mastery goes far beyond the typical psychological exploration of personal darkness. It requires the empath to confront the specific shadows that have developed around their empathic function. This includes what I call the savior shadow, the hidden grandiosity that believes you can and should rescue others from their darkness. This shadow often masks itself as humility and service, but beneath the surface lies an inflated sense of personal power and responsibility. The savior shadow must be integrated through the painful recognition that you cannot save anyone. You cannot heal trauma that is not yours. You cannot force consciousness onto those who are not ready to receive it. Your power lies not in your ability to fix others, but in your capacity to remain clear and present while they do their own work. Another aspect of the empathic shadow is what I call the victim shadow, the part that has found identity and power through suffering. This shadow resists healing because healing would mean losing the specialness that comes from being the one who carries everyone else's pain. The victim shadow must be integrated through developing sources of identity and value that do not depend on suffering or service. The empath must discover who they are beyond their ability to feel and heal, beyond their sensitivity and their service. There is also the superior shadow, the part that feels more evolved, more conscious, more capable than those who cannot feel as deeply. The shadow looks down on those who are less sensitive, while simultaneously resenting them for their apparent freedom from empathic burden. The integration of the superior shadow requires genuine humility, the recognition that sensitivity is not inherently superior to other ways of being, that absorption is not the same as wisdom, that feeling deeply does not automatically confer spiritual advancement. The 14th movement, the recognition of personal patterns. This means facing your own capacity for cruelty, your own hunger for power, your own addiction to being needed. It means acknowledging the parts of you that have enjoyed being special, being different, being the one who understands what others cannot. The recognition of these shadow aspects is often shocking for empaths who have built their identity around their compassion and selflessness. To discover that you have been cruel in your kindness, manipulative in your helping, and addicted to being needed challenges the core of the empathic self-concept. But this recognition is liberating. It frees the empath from the exhausting performance of perpetual goodness. It allows them to be human, to have needs, to make mistakes, to be imperfect without losing their value or their gifts. The addiction to being needed is particularly challenging to face because it often masquerades as virtue. The empath who cannot say no, who always makes themselves available, who takes on everyone else's problems, appears to be selflessly serving others, but beneath this appearance often lies a desperate need for validation, significance, and control. This addiction serves several unconscious functions. It provides identity and purpose. It creates the illusion of being indispensable. It offers a sense of superiority over those who need your help. And it provides a constant distraction from your own unresolved issues and unlived life. Breaking this addiction requires the empath to face the terror of being ordinary, of not being special, of not being needed. It requires developing sources of self-worth that do not depend on service to others. It requires learning to tolerate the anxiety that arises when you are not actively helping someone. The hunger for power through empathy is another difficult shadow to acknowledge. The empath may believe they are powerless, always giving their power away to others, but the ability to absorb and process others' psychological material is itself a form of power. The power to influence, to be needed, to know others' secrets, to feel superior through suffering. This power becomes corrupted when it is wielded unconsciously. The empath may use their sensitivity to manipulate others into feeling guilty, to gain information they have no right to possess, to maintain relationships through emotional dependency rather than genuine connection. The 15th movement, the transformation of service. Only when you have made peace with your personal shadow can you begin to work consciously with the collective shadow that seeks you out. The integration of personal shadow marks a crucial turning point in the empath's development. It is only after facing their own darkness that they can work safely with other shadow material without being contaminated or overwhelmed by it. This transformation shifts the entire foundation of empathic service. Instead of serving from wound, the empath begins to serve from wholeness. Instead of giving from emptiness, they give from overflow. Instead of helping from compulsion, they help from choice. The quality of presence that emerges from integrated empathic service is entirely different from unconscious absorption. There is a stillness, a groundedness, a quality of unshakable presence that creates safety for other shadow material to emerge and be witnessed. This presence does not seek to fix or heal. It does not take on responsibility for others' transformation. It simply holds space, reflects clearly, and trusts the intelligence of the psyche to do its own work. The integrated empath becomes what I call a hollow bone, clear, strong, and empty enough for the sacred to flow through without obstruction. They are no longer blocked by their own unintegrated material, their own unconscious patterns, their own need to be needed. The 16th movement, the cycle transformed. And here is where the cycle transforms from unconscious compulsion to sacred service. Instead of being pulled into others' darkness by unconscious magnetism, you begin to choose when and how to engage. Instead of absorbing their shadow material, you learn to alchemically transform it through your conscious presence. The transformation of the cycle represents a fundamental shift from passive victimhood to active agency. The empath is no longer at the mercy of every shadow that seeks their light. They develop the discernment to choose which shadows they will work with and which they will decline. This choice is not made from judgment or superiority. It is made from wisdom and self-preservation. The conscious empath understands that they have limited energy and that this energy must be stewarded wisely if they are to serve their true purpose.
the ability to decline shadow work that is not theirs to do is as important as the ability to engage with shadow work that is calling for their attention. This discernment comes from understanding the difference between serving the collective unconscious and enabling individual unconsciousness. When the empath chooses to engage with shadow material, they do so with full awareness of what they are undertaking. They prepare themselves energetically and psychologically.